Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation on writing powerful abstracts. Thank you very much to Memorial's Graduate Student Union and the Alrdrich Committee for inviting me to give this presentation. The purpose of the presentation is to explore abstracts and different kinds of abstracts and to provide you with the information you need to write really good abstracts. So what is an abstract? An abstract is a summary of a research article or a thesis or a conference presentation or any other kind of research-related papers. And the purpose of an abstract generally is to help someone, to help a reader understand the paper's purpose quickly. So the abstract provides a summary of a much larger paper or presentation, and the summary is usually very short, but it contains the major components of the paper. There are different kinds of abstracts, and abstracts are written differently depending on the discipline that you're in. So you are going to need to adjust what I'm saying to particular disciplines. But what I'm hoping you'll get from the presentation is that you'll be able to analyze abstracts in your discipline and then adjust what you need for your particular situation. So let's look at some of the different kinds or types of abstracts. We could call them genres, so different abstract genres. So the dissertation abstract, and I'm using dissertation and thesis, I'm using them to represent the same document. Then you have article abstracts, and what I mean by that is peer-reviewed journal articles or any kind of journal article. It could even be a book chapter. Abstracts for calls for proposals, which I'll explain when I come to that, and conference abstracts, which I know you are all interested in at this point in time. Okay, so let's look at dissertation abstracts. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, but dissertation abstracts are usually a little bit longer than abstracts for an article. So they might be a page to a page and a half. And the point of the dissertation abstract is to summarize a thesis, usually for examiners, but for other readers after that. And it's usually read in conjunction with the thesis. And the purpose of a dissertation abstract is to really emphasize the main arguments in the thesis. Article abstracts are usually written once the paper is finished. So once the paper's been written, then you would write the abstract. These are usually very short. They might be 200 to 300 words, depending on the journal. And they're submitted with the paper to the journal editors. And the key purpose is to summarize the article. So the abstract is always read in conjunction with the paper. So the paper might be accepted even though an abstract is poor. Usually in the review process, you would be asked to revise the abstract. But once the paper is published, then the abstract serves to sell the articles to readers. And by this I mean people scan abstracts when they're looking for papers to read, and they will make a judgment on whether or not to read the paper based on the abstract. And research shows that this is really quite important, that readers will skip over articles if the abstracts are not attractive to them. So abstracts for calls for proposals, these are requests for specifically themed papers or chapters for either collected book editions or special editions of journals. So what will happen is a call for proposals will go out on listservs, or it will be advertised through various media. And then what you would do is respond to that call for a proposal by writing an abstract. Usually these abstracts are much longer, but they could start at 500 words and then be as long as 2,000 words, depending on the call. But really what you want to do with this kind of abstract is to respond to the call. So you need to show with this abstract how your paper would fit into that particular collection of journal articles or book chapters. So the reader will be assessing that, whether or not it will fit into the theme of the book collection or journal special edition. So in this case, if the abstract is weak, it's unlikely to be accepted. I mean, there might be other reasons why your paper isn't accepted. It could be that there are several papers on the same theme and the editors decide to choose only one. But what I'm really saying is that your abstract needs to be strong if you want it to be included. Right, on to conference abstracts, which is what I know you're all interested in at this point in time. And the conference abstract summarizes a presentation. So it's a little bit different because you may not have written the paper at this point. So you don't have a paper to go along with the abstract. Usually conference abstracts are quite short, but some conferences will ask for much longer abstracts. So you need to respond to whatever the conference organizers ask you to do. The purpose of a conference abstract is to convince the conference organizers or the reviewers of the value of your presentation for that particular conference. So if there's a conference theme, you want to try and respond to the theme in the abstract. Now, not all conferences are very strict about this, but usually conferences have themes and you want to try and respond to it in your abstract. Some conferences are more competitive than others. Some conferences accept all the abstracts. Other conferences only accept a certain number of abstracts. So the difference between a conference abstract and a research article abstract is that the conference abstract is submitted well ahead of the conference and possibly before the paper has even been written. You may not have analyzed your data yet. You may not be sure how this paper is going to work out, but you still have to write the conference abstract. And often the abstract stands alone as a document that has to convince a review committee, and often conferences will have a process of blind peer review. So you have to anonymize your abstract and you won't know who's reviewing it. Again, the abstract sells your research ideas. So once it is accepted for the conference, it goes into the conference abstract book, and conference goers will make their decision on whether or not to attend your presentation from what you have written and what they can see in the abstract book. So, of course, it's quite an important document. So just some general tips on writing abstracts. Pay attention to the abstract specifications. Whatever you are asked to do, do that. So adhere to the word length. If they ask for 500 words, don't write 501 words. Check, the fonts and all the other specifications. Make sure that you have adhered to that. If the conference or call for proposals has a theme or a specific call, you need to respond to that. Something that's very important is that abstracts are usually written in the past tense, the study was conducted, or in the present tense, the study is being conducted, but it's not really written in the future tense. I will conduct the study. And this is something that's you have to get your head around this, because in many cases you are writing the abstract before you conduct the study. So it makes intuitive sense to say, I will be analyzing the data like this. But the conference organizers are reading it as if you have already finished the work. So it needs to be in the past tense. I hope I've made that clear. Try to make your abstract interesting. As with all writing, the more deadly dull and boring it is, the less likely you are to get readers or conference goers to attend to what you're doing. The more interesting it is, the more you are able to make what you're doing sound important and accessible, the better response you're going to get. We all work in very specialized fields. We all have lots of specialized jargon and language that we use. And what I'm suggesting is that in the abstract, you try to cut back on that language and try and make your abstract as accessible as possible, mostly because it is there to help you attract readers. So use short sentences rather than long sentences. Don't use acronyms or abbreviations. unless they are absolutely necessary. Limit the jargon or specialized language. Okay, now we're moving on to what goes into an abstract. And if you've seen any of my other presentations before, you will be familiar with some of this, which I've taken from Sharon Merriam. Okay, so the first thing that goes into an abstract is a statement of the problem. You could even use the sentence, the problem here is, when you are starting to identify the problem and you're not sure in the beginning stages. So you're looking for a sentence or two that identifies the problem. The problem is very important in research because it provides the real world rationale. It answers the so what question. Why do I have to listen to this research? Why do I have to read it? If you articulate a problem that is necessary, urgent, and is something that is important, you are more likely to get a response from a reader. The knowledge gap, and again here you would put in a sentence or two around the knowledge gap, and this satisfies the academic premise that all research builds on previous research and provides the academic rationale for this research. It also situates your research within a body of literature, and it shows the kind of gap that your research will be filling. The knowledge gap is somewhat of a constructed knowledge gap because there might be lots of literature out there on your particular topic, and you will create a specific niche. Okay, you need a sentence or two around the context, and this is particularly important if you're dealing with anything that has to do with an international audience. So you would need to adjust what you're saying here for the audience. So the context is, when does this take place? Who is it about, or what is it about? What is it that you are studying? So for example, if you are used to talking about education in your local environment, you might need to explain certain things for an international audience. I'm just going to jump down to the conceptual framework, a sentence or two about the conceptual framework. Now, this is not always required in an abstract. In your particular discipline, particularly if you work with more theory, it might be something that's much more common. Your research project might be theoretical, so then you would have a sentence or two about this. I'm using a catch-all phrase, conceptual framework here, but what I really mean is the perspective or lens that you are using to frame your study. So it could be a model, it could be a process framework, it could be some kind of diagram that shows mobility through the diagram. It could be a theorist, it could be anything that is a broader lens. What I mean by logic and evidence here is that any research project carries its own internal logic. So the order that you would create this abstract out of will change depending on your particular project. So to give you an example, if your project is premised on a real world problem, perhaps there was a riot of some kind or protests of some kind in a particular year, then you might want to begin your abstract with that real world problem. But perhaps for you, in your research project, there's a huge knowledge gap in the way we use materials or procedures or methods. So you might want to have the knowledge gap as the first thing that you begin with, because that's most significant for your research project. Perhaps the context is something, that is important, and then you would begin with that. If your project is particularly theoretical or the conceptual framework is important, you might want to begin with that. So what I'm talking about, the logic, is that any abstract will have a logic to it, and that logic is dependent on your particular project and what you want to emphasize. And you would shift the order of these components depending on your particular project. Now, evidence refers to providing sources, published peer review papers for components of your abstract. So evidence in academic contexts generally comes from two sources: primary research, where you go out and collect the raw data, and secondary research, which is published and is often vetted by a peer review system, so it carries authority. So if you can provide evidence in the form of sources to add to your abstract, it will make it stronger. But there's a caveat to this, that not all abstracts have sources in them. So you might want to have a look at the abstracts, example abstracts for what you are trying to prepare. So for example, journal articles generally don't contain abstracts because the abstract is submitted with the article and you can read the detail in the article. However, conference abstracts often do contain sources because they are standalone documents. So this is where you're going to need to look at examples and then make these decisions in relation to your own discipline. Okay, continuing with what goes into an abstract. The next thing that goes into the abstract is a statement of purpose, and this again is a sentence or two. So the purpose of this research is to, and then whatever word you use after that implies a methodology. If you use the word explore, it means that's a qualitative, open-ended type of study. If you use a word like evaluate, that means that you have some kind of starting point, an end point, and some mechanism in between to evaluate between those 2 points. So you need to think quite carefully about that particular word. And then you might have a statement, a sentence, to show that you're closing the knowledge gap that you identified earlier on in the abstract. And what the purpose does is to state the broad goals of the research. So in the abstract, you would also need to have a sentence or two about the methodology, the methods, the materials, the procedures. And here it's a very summarized statement about what you would probably have in a page or two in the actual document. You could also include research questions where you unpack the problem. So the research questions should unpack the problem. They also give an indication of the scope of the project, so you don't want to have 10 questions for a conference paper because that would be too much. In abstracts, you always find results or findings. And, I'm saying 3 key findings, but really what I'm saying is you can't have 10 key findings in an abstract. Depending on the amount of time you have, you could summarize it into 1 key finding, or if you've got the space, add a few more. The other thing you might want to include in an abstract as a final sentence is the key message. And this is, what is this paper about? And if you wanted someone to cite you on this paper, what would that be? So if you said, this paper is about, what do you want them to take away from your abstract or your paper? So that's something that is often optional, but it's worth putting in there if you want a really strong abstract, and it's worth thinking about. So given that abstracts are often very short, and what I've just told you to put into the abstract can end up being quite long, what can you cut if you need to cut? And if you only have 250 words, what are the most important elements? So the most important elements are the research problem, the purpose of the research, the methodology, methods, materials, procedures, how you went about doing it, the key findings, and then that key message, either the implications or the key message. What can be cut would be the knowledge gap, the research questions, the conceptual framework. But again, it really depends on your discipline and it depends on the purpose of the abstract. So the more space you have, the more words you can use. I would encourage you to include all the components. But if, of course, you only have a small amount of space, then you need to make decisions about what to include and what to leave out. And those decisions will be based on your discipline and what your discipline highlights as being important. And you will find that out by reading abstracts in your discipline for the particular type of genre. So research article abstracts or conference abstracts. Okay, just a few quick tips. Be bold in your opening sentence, but of course I'm saying this with caution because you may not be in a discipline where bold opening sentences are valued, but of course you may, so then you can. But what I'm suggesting is that you want to make your opening sentence count. If you can't be bold, at least be clear so that you're conveying something that will pull your reader in. The other thing you want to have in the abstract is what's new about your research and the significance of your research. You really want the essence of it, and you can't have the details. Right, so the other information that often goes along with abstracts would be titles. The title is very important. It's often what attracts the reader or the conference goer. And for titles, you want to get a clear sense of the paper. For titles, you also want to have searchable keywords in the title that reflect what will happen in the paper. If you can, try and show your original contribution. And judge your title on whether it represents the paper and attracts a reader. Other additional information that is often asked for when you submit an abstract would be keywords. So you want to make sure the keywords reflect what's in your study and that they are searchable words. So if someone was searching for your particular document, that they would be likely to put in these keywords. Sorry. Sometimes conference organizers or journals will ask for, or calls for proposals will ask for contact information, the names of all the authors or presenters, and sometimes short bios. And I'm going to show you an example of that. You may also be asked to anonymize your abstract. And this is where you would separate the author page from the abstract page. And you want to make sure that the abstract then doesn't contain any information that identifies you. And this would be if the abstract was going to be blind peer reviewed. So here's an example of a conference abstract that I submitted. So this is a real conference abstract. And the conference asked for this layout. You can see there's a very specific layout. It asked for the title, the contact details, a bio, whether or not it was an individual presentation, a poster, or a roundtable symposium. And the conference organizers might have different specifications for abstracts for each of those different kinds of presentations. They also asked us to identify what our requirements would be. Here's the abstract itself, and this abstract I wrote before I had conducted the analysis. I had collected the data, but I hadn't conducted the analysis, and I wasn't really sure at this point how the paper was going to be focused. And you can actually see that in the abstract. It's a little bit unfocused. But if you have a look at the first sentence, I'm trying to attract people who would be interested in literature reviews and graduate student writing. So that's up front there in the first sentence. I've provided sources because this was a conference abstract, and it's a standalone document. So I have to convince my readers without the paper. Some conferences will give you a word count for the actual abstract, and then you can submit references separately. Others will only give you a specific word count, and then you won't be able to use references. So you need to look at that, because some applications you do online, and there's an online box, and the box takes X number of characters, and if you go over the character, it will be deleted. If you go over the character limit, it will be deleted. So you need to check that. I just want to, so if you have a look at the components in here, I have situated it within a literature, and I've used one of these literacies, which is a conceptual framework. You may not know that, but that links to a conceptual framework. But I haven't gone into it in any detail. So if we go a bit further down, the purpose of this research was to explore. A further purpose was, oh, there I've got the conceptual framework, according to an academic literacies framework. So there's the conceptual framework in there. If we move down, in this qualitative study, there I give you in one sentence what I did, right? Collected graduate student papers. And then the next sentence, all papers were analyzed for descriptive and analytical writing using analytical tools drawn from the research literature. So in the actual paper, that would constitute a page or so. But of course, you can only put a sentence in here. And then at the end, preliminary findings. So because I haven't actually done the analysis and I don't really know what the findings are going to be, I'm putting in that tentativeness that I might change later on when I give the presentation. And then I can say, well, in the abstract, I thought this is what I was going to find. But now that I've conducted the analysis, I know that this is what I'm going to find. Okay, just a quick point about your identity, your scholarly identity. Anytime you write academically, you are portraying this academic identity. So what you want to try and do is come across in this very scholarly, professional way. And one of the ways you do that is by paying attention to the guidelines. So responding to the call, not going over the word count, making sure that you have followed the instructions, and editing for any kind of errors. The point I wanted to make here is that people often think that productive writers or long-time academics sit down and produce these fabulous abstracts in one sitting. But really that's not the case. Everybody works at their abstracts. Everyone begins with a very bad draft and then fixes it up, gets feedback on it perhaps, and then does more work on it. So really there's a process involved in writing abstracts. It's not something that you think about and then just produce. In fact, most people begin by writing very bad drafts and then they fix it up. And that's the kind of process I'd encourage you to take, is to get anything down, start with something, get something down, and then fix it up, and gradually fix it up to a point where you want to share it with someone. Now that you know what components should go into an abstract, you can ask someone specifically to give you feedback on those components. Okay, common phrases in abstracts. If you're struggling for the kind of language that you want to use in the abstract, visit this website where they have some very useful phrases. Here they're talking about dissertation abstracts, but you can adjust. The kind of language you use will be dependent on your particular discipline, so you can also learn from reading other abstracts in your field. So this is just another slide to show you some of the common language taken from that website, which you can use. I'd encourage you to use active language. We studied 15 patients versus passive language. 15 patients were studied. Just because it's much more readable, and passive language can be very awkward and dense and long-winded. Again, there's a caveat here. In your discipline, if passive language is much more common, then obviously you want to use that. But try and reduce the amount of passive language that you use. I want to move on to different abstract styles here, because there are different ways of writing the abstract. And this particular article that I have up here shows 13 ways to write an abstract. I'm just going to show you the three or four of the most common. And in this particular article where you see the abstract, that is the most common form of abstract. It's called the block abstract, where there are no paragraphs. It's just one paragraph, one block paragraph. That's generally the way abstracts are presented. The structured abstract is something that's becoming much more popular, and here's the abstract from the paper that I wrote that came out of that conference presentation, although I didn't present it at the conference. I decided not to go, but this was the actual paper now. And you can see if you compare it, that this one is much more specific because I've now actually done the work. And the structured abstract will usually have headings, and you have to write according to those headings. But one thing I wanted to point out, although here there is no heading called problem, you can see that under originality and value, I have inserted the problem in there. So the components that I've shown you are all in there, but they have been worked into the headings. Okay. Graphical abstracts, so those of you who are in the sciences will probably have more tables and maybe some graphics in your abstracts. It's not unusual to have a table in an abstract in the sciences. Again, have a look at examples of abstracts in your discipline. That will give you an indication of what is valued and what people are using. This is a particular kind of abstract where the study is shown in visual form. So this, what I've put up here, is the actual abstract. It's very hard to understand if you're not part of that specialized community. But obviously, if you are part of that community, then you know exactly what's going on. Something that's becoming much more popular, tweetable abstracts. And this is where you present your research in 140 characters or less. You probably know a lot more about this than I do. But anyway, think about that. Another type of abstract that's becoming very popular is video abstracts. If you want to know more about this, you just need to Google video abstracts. It'll take you to publishers' websites where there are instructions on how to produce video abstracts. If you search YouTube, you'll find them. What I've put up here is an example of a video abstract. I must say I find them very appealing. I'm not quite sure when I would find the time to do one, but hopefully one day I will. But I think it's a very exciting way to present an abstract. Okay, typical problems with abstracts. The main problem is if there's a key component missing, particularly the problem, and leading on from that if the significance is not clear. If it's too difficult to read, it's too dense, too much jargon, too many acronyms and abbreviations so that meaning is lost. If concepts are vague, they're not explained and not specific enough. I know it sounds like a contradiction to say don't be too dense and specific, but don't be too vague. And hopefully I'll show you in an example. If the context is not explained, that can make the project very abstract, particularly for an international audience. If the findings are not included or expressed as findings, and if there's too much literature or background and not enough focus. Okay, so let's have a look at this example. What I'd really like you to do is to stop the recording, read through the example, and ask yourself questions about this abstract. Now that we've been through what should go into an abstract and what it should look like, even if you just come up with one question, begin to analyze this abstract. Okay, so here are some of the comments that I would make, and this is really just to show you. The purpose is not to pull this abstract apart. So one of the things you want to be sure of is, does the title match the abstract? So are the concepts mentioned in the title also mentioned in the abstract? And then the same thing you can do again is check if the keywords match the title and concepts in the abstract. And if you look at this abstract, the keywords talk about burnout, but burnout is not in the abstract, and the concept stress is in the abstract, which is quite a vague concept. So if you're focusing on burnout, you want burnout to be in the abstract, and if this was a conference presentation, I would certainly have sources to identify what you mean by burnout and whose perceptions of burnout you are drawing on. And if you look at the keywords again, there's one keyword called response, which really means nothing. And I think this was a typo. I think it should be relaxation response. but because there's a comma in there, response stands alone. And that as a keyword will not generate anything for you. Okay, so let's just have a look in terms of vagueness and specificity. So middle school teachers, here's where the context needs to be fleshed out a little bit. So which schools are you talking about? Which teachers? Are you talking about all the teachers in middle school or specific kinds of teachers? The concept of stress is too broad. Academic achievement, are you talking about performance through grades? And again, the entire school environment. So if some of those concepts that I've identified were specific, then you could probably keep entire school environment. But because quite a few of these are vague, it calls into question other vague comments. So a little bit later down, school and community counselors. So the question I would have is who are community counselors? And perhaps this is a contextual question as well. Optimal positions, what does an optimal position mean? And to collaboratively, so I'm not sure about that. How would they do that? How would community counselors collaborate with teachers to decrease stress, teacher levels, etc., etc.? And again, enhance student achievement. Are you talking about grades? Are you talking about something else? And then again, a little bit later down, a stress management technique. It would have been better to perhaps put in the name. The relaxation response would have been perhaps a bit better. One thing that concerned me about this, one thing that I would question, let's put it that way, is this 1975 source, and how you could shape that in an abstract is to say something like the classic relaxation response from Benson and Clipper. Then what you're doing there is you're tagging for the reader that although this is an older source, it is still an important one. But just to have a source in there that is really quite old now, without that tagging or the meta discourse, might cause questions in your readers' minds. And then to look at the themes at the end, and the question I would have is, are these the same as conclusions? So if you look at them, high stress levels, what does that tell you about high stress levels? What do you know now after reading the abstract about high stress levels? And in fact, you can't tell anything from the way these findings have been written. So you might want to say something like the relaxation response decreased high stress levels. Then that is a finding. Okay, or that there was a lack of burnout awareness before the relaxation response intervention. Something like that, right? Just putting in these themes doesn't provide you with enough information to understand the findings. Of course, then what you also want to do is to look for the key components. And if we just do that quickly, you can see that it's not really clear what the methodology was. If you try and identify the methodology, that's not really in there. The implication is implied. The abstract does use sources, and you would need to check if this was typical in your field. The problem is there, though. Okay. The other thing that's not there is the purpose of the research. It's not clear what the purpose of the research was. It's implied, it's hidden in there, but it's not obvious. Okay, let's have a look at another example. So the question I would ask you, and you can use examples from your own field and ask these same questions. But what I would want you to do here is to say, what decisions did the author make about what to include and what to exclude, given the amount of space she had? If you look, the first sentence is very strong and bold. Plagiarism is regarded as a heinous crime, but anecdotal evidence suggests. So there's the problem, right? This article reports on a study, so you're getting a bit of the methodology. Interviews were also conducted. You get a sense of what data was collected. The student writing was found to contain. Here come the findings. So you can see that the author, and then the implications of these findings. the author has decided to omit some of the key components of an abstract and focused on particular things that she has decided will be important for this abstract. So again, another question in regards to doing your own analysis of abstracts in your field. What is the language and the tone of the abstract? So if you have a look at this one, plagiarism is viewed by many academics as a kind of Pandora's box. The language is very accessible. There's a metaphor in there. The elements contained inside are too frightening to allow escape for fear of the havoc they may result. So that's a very bold statement as well. Later on, you'll see in this article, I examine the dilemma. So the use of I, is that something that you can do in your discipline? And this particular author has only used it once. Oh no, and then there's a my research indicates. So have a look at the language and tone of abstracts in your discipline. What you can also see in this example and the previous example is that the components are there depending on the decisions the authors have made, but they have shifted the order of the components. Most abstracts begin with the problem. Okay, on to a last example. The questions you would ask yourself, because these are all abstracts that come from published papers. So the question you would ask yourself is, how would you do this differently if it was a conference abstract or a call for proposals? And the other question I'm asking you here is, how is the literature dealt with in this particular abstract? So for a conference abstract, you certainly would put in literature and you would expand on it if you had more space. But the way they've done it here is to say there's general agreement in the literature that international students are more likely to plagiarize compared to their native speaker peers, and in many instances plagiarism is unintentional. So because this is an abstract for a published article, it's not necessary to have the sources. The sources will be in the paper. In a conference abstract, you would need to provide the sources there. But you can see they've identified the literature there without actually referring to the sources. Okay, I'm not going to go through that any further. I just wanted to give you some ways to analyze abstracts in your own field and some way of identifying what you would need to include in your own abstracts. If you need any further resources on thesis writing and publishing, please have a look on YouTube. If you search my name, I have a number of videos on different aspects of writing a thesis, and I also have a blog. Here are some resources for you if you want to read further. You could also just search for writing conference abstracts, writing abstracts in the sciences, writing abstracts in the medical sciences. There are plenty of papers out there on how to do it. Obviously, some are much more helpful than others. I hope this was useful for you and that you go away and write absolutely wonderful abstracts. Thank you.